And now Magnus going in for the kill. Knight takes f7 on the board. What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, I have a brilliant attacking game played between Magnus Carlsen and the notorious Vladimir Kramnik from the 2020 Legends of Chess tournament. Now in the game, Magnus Carlsen is playing as white. He opens 1d4 and Vladimir goes knight to f6. Then we have c4 and then e6 on the board. So far, very standard stuff. And here, Magnus does go knight to c3 in this game, allowing the Nimzo Indian with the move bishop b4. However, here, instead of that, Vladimir actually went d5, expanding in the center, and we do have a queen's gambit decline on the board. And this is a little bit unusual at the highest level. Again, bishop b4 with the Nimzo Indian was the most common idea. However, here after d5, Magnus does have the option of getting a very good version of a queen's gambit decline exchange variation if he wants it, and that is what he goes for. So here, c takes d5 is the move, and now knight takes d5 is an interesting idea that Vladimir does play sometimes. Instead, e takes d5 on the board, and now the strongest idea by Magnus, bishop g5, and this right here is the real starting point of the Queen's Gambit Decline exchange variation. This is a very, very old line. It's been played in a lot of World Championship matches. It is thought to be slightly better for white. However, black does have very good chances as well. Now here, Vladimir, he goes c6, the main idea, just bolstering the pawn on d5. Of course, bishop takes f6 here was a real threat. That would damage black's pawn structure, as queen takes would lose the pawn on d5. Therefore, c6 defending the pawn on d5 is the main idea. Now here, Magnus, he goes e3, setting up bishop d3 ideas. And Vladimir goes h6, trying to drive back the bishop, a very interesting idea. Now bishop h4 on the board, and then bishop e7 for Vladimir Kramnik. Now here, Magnus, he goes bishop d3, the main idea, simply stopping bishop f5 ideas from black. And now Magnus will be able to go queen c2 in the future, getting the queen and the bishop both lining up on this diagonal. Now here, Vladimir castles, and then here in this position, Magnus Carlsen makes a very committal move. He goes knight g to e2, and this move here is very, very important in this Queen's Gambit Decline exchange variation. The idea being Magnus wants to castle on the king side and then go f3 at some point, and potentially threatening e4 in the future. This is perhaps the strongest way to play this variation, and it was a big favorite of Garry Kasparov. All right, here, Vladimir Kramnik, how does he respond? He starts rook to e8, a very typical move in this variation. Now castles, and here Vladimir, he plays his first committal move of the game. He goes knight to h5, offering the trade of those dark squared bishops. Now this move is very important. Typically, when you go h6 in this variation of the Queen's Gambit Decline, you do follow up with the move knight to h5. Of course, there were plenty of other ideas. For example, going knight d7 and then knight f8 and knight g6 or knight e6 is one idea. Another idea is g6 at some point. However, instead, knight to h5 on the board. And now, of course, the threat is simply bishop takes h4. Therefore, Magnus does take on e7. If instead he goes bishop g3, he will lose the bishop pair for absolutely nothing, so that is not a good idea. Instead, bishop takes e7 on the board, and Vladimir does take back with the queen. Queen takes e7, and now the queen is on a very good square, applying pressure to the very weak e4 point of Magnus. All right, now Magnus Carlsen in this position, the next step in his plan, he can't go f3 yet. He has to move the queen somewhere, and he has two good squares for the queen, d2 and c2. Both of those moves are playable, but in the game, Magnus Carlsen does go queen d2 in this position. The idea being he wants to support the pawn on e3. That way he can go rook a to e1, maybe move the knight somewhere, and then go f3 with that e3 pawn being properly defended. So, very good idea by Magnus. Of course, queen c2 is also playable, and you can play queen c2 before going castles in this variation. However, the benefit of castles before queen c2, again, you do keep that queen d2 idea in reserve. So, a very subtle idea by Magnus, but overall a very good idea. Now here, Vladimir Kramnik, how should he be proceeding in this position? Well, the next step in his plan is going to be developing the knight on b8 to the d7 square, and that is what he plays in the game. So, knight d7, the most flexible idea. And now the knight on d7 will likely go to one of three squares, f8, f6, or b6, so we'll have to wait and see where Vladimir wants to put the knight on the next move. Now here, Magnus, he continues his plan, rook a to e1, by far the strongest idea, and that rook will be supporting the pawn on e3 in the future. That means after the knight moves, f3 will be a good move, potentially threatening e4, breaking in the center, and that is Magnus Carlsen's main idea in this line. All right, here, Vladimir, as discussed, that knight on d7 does have to go somewhere, and again, there are three good squares for the knight, b6, f6, and f8, and they all have their subtle differences. If you go on b6, the main idea is playing on the queen side. You may want to follow up ideas like a5, a4, potentially threatening knight to c4 in the future. Now, knight to f8 is also a very good move. From there, you can go to e6 or g6, depending on how the game develops. And also, believe it or not, knight d to f6 is also very playable. Now, this move may look risky. After all, these knights on f6 and h5 are sort of tripping over each other. However, for tactical reasons, it does work out. You can't go g4 right away, as the bishop on c8 does cover that square. And instead, if you go, say, h3 and then g4, trying to knock back this knight and trying to trap it, believe it or not, the bishop sacrifice, bishop takes g4, does work out in a lot of lines, and black will get a very vicious attack against the white king. So, knight d to f6, also playable, and in the game, Vladimir Kramnik does go knight to f8. Now, the idea behind this move, he wants to go knight to e6 on the next move, and e6 will be a very good square for the knight, and from there, Vladimir can potentially go c5, breaking on the queen side. All right, here, Magnus Carlsen, the next step in his plan, it's going to be setting up the f3 brick. And to do that, you have to move the knight on e2 somewhere else. And where is the knight going to go? Well, f4 and g3 are both covered by the knight on h5. If you go to either of those squares, knight takes f4 or knight takes g3 will be the move, and Vladimir will trade off yet another pair of minor pieces, and that will diminish Magnus Carlsen's attacking potential in this game. Therefore, instead of those moves, he actually goes knight to c1, retreating the knight back to the first rank, but freeing up the rook to defend e3 and setting up f3. So, a very, very typical Magnus Carlsen move, retreating a piece to improve his position. All right, here, Vladimir Kramnik, what should he be doing in this position? Well, the next step in his plan is likely going to be getting his bishop on c8 out into the game. So, bishop d7 and bishop e6 are both very, very good, very playable moves. And you can also play on the queen side with ideas like a5 and b5. However, instead of either of those moves, here, Vladimir Kramnik, he does go knight h to f6. And this turns out to be a slightly weak move and maybe the first real inaccuracy of the game. I mean, the knight on h5 was very well placed, and it's basically a wasted tempo retreating the knight to the f6 square, as it was doing a good job on the h5 square. Now here, Magnus, he just continues his plan, f3 on the board, setting up the future e4 break. Now, it's very important to note, in this line, when you go f3, you don't want to go e4 right away. This move often requires a lot of preparation. For example, Magnus may go king to h1, h3, queen to f2, and any number of other moves setting up that break. It's just really important in this line to make all the preparatory moves you can before going e4. That will increase the potency of the move when you do play it. Now here, Vladimir, again, he has a wide variety of moves that he could make. Again, bishop d7 and bishop e6 are very playable. And again, you can also play on the queen side with, say, c5 expanding immediately. Instead, Vladimir, knight to e6, a very flexible move, a very good square for the knight. But the one problem with this move is it does block the queen and the rook's communication with the e4 square. So now here, Magnus Carlsen, he spots the flaw with this move, and he actually jumps back with the knight c1 to e2. The idea being, now you can go e4 on the next move, and the pawn on the e3 square is not being attacked by the queen. For example, if the knight was still on f8, then queen takes e3 would win a pawn, and that would just completely eliminate Magnus Carlsen's attacking chances in the game. But now, knight 1 to e2 is actually a very good move. And what is Vladimir going to do? Well, first of all, you cannot retreat the knight back to the f8 square. Knight to f8 would be a terrible move. Then you just go e4, expanding in the center, and Magnus would have that key break that he wants and a vicious attack threatening e5 on the next move. So instead, Vladimir, he has to find something else to do. Well, there are a few good moves. For example, queen d6 make the strongest idea here, trying to centralize the queen. Instead, Vladimir does break on the queen side with the move b5. The threat here is simply b4, trying to drive back that knight on c3 to somewhere else. So, for example, if Magnus does go e4, breaking in the center, then b4 would hit the knight, and that would be good for Vladimir. So here, Magnus, he can't go e4 right away. Instead, he plays the very strong idea, knight to g3. The idea being is rerouting the knight over to the g3 square and freeing up the e2 square for the other knight. That way, if Vladimir does go b4, knight to e2 will be the move. So Magnus just dancing with his knights here. All right, Vladimir, he continues with his idea of expanding on the queen side. He plays a strong idea, a5. Again, just gaining more space. And beyond that, he also frees up that a6 square for the light squared bishop. He may even want to go bishop to a6 at some point in the future. And very importantly, I do want to point out, if Vladimir went for the immediate b4 break on the queen side, then knight to f5, jumping in with the knight and hitting the queen before moving your knight on c3 would be very, very strong. So a5, a very good idea by Vladimir, not falling for that b4 knight to f5 idea. Now, Magnus Carlsen here, what should he be doing? Well, again, there are a few different ideas. Jumping in with the knight to f5 is playable. You can also go knight to e2, again, getting out of the way of the b4 advance on the queen side. Instead here, Magnus does go queen to f2, another good preparatory move before going e4. Again, all these moves are very, very playable. Now here, Vladimir, the best idea is going to be b4, continuing with your plan. But instead, he plays the move bishop to a6. And this move turns out to be a little bit slow in this position. The idea being he wants to go b4 and then force off the trade of the light squared bishops on this diagonal. However, again, it's a little slow. And here, Magnus, he just continues to increase the pressure. Knight to f5 on the board, hits the queen. The queen has to go somewhere. In the game, queen d8, but then Magnus, knight to e2, getting the knight out of the way of that future b4 advance, and setting up ideas like knight g3 or knight to f4. Both those moves could be very good in the future. Now here, Vladimir, again, b4 is the best move, but again, he delays it. Instead of that, he plays a different break on the queen side, c5, and this move, believe it or not, turns out to be a very significant mistake. Now, on the one hand, it does have some logic behind it. Vladimir wanted to go c5, and in order to do that, he had to defend the pawn on b5 with the bishop. So, going bishop a6 and then c5 does make some sense in that regard. However, if you wanted to go c6, c5, you really don't need to go b5, a5, and bishop a6 to do it. Therefore, overall, this plan is just a little bit slow. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he's going to switch gears a little bit. The idea of going e4 is no longer as attractive as there's just too much tension in the center with these pawns. Therefore, instead, Magnus will go for a piece-based attack on the king side, and he starts the attack with the very strong, very precise move queen to g3. Now, first of all, this move does threaten knight takes h6 with check, as the pawn on g7 will be pinned to the king on the g8 square. So, very big threat, and here Vladimir, he has to find the right response. Now, the strongest move is going to be knight to h5, both hitting the queen on g3 and defending g7 with the knight. So very good multi-purpose move. However, Magnus could just move out of the attack with queen to h3, keeping the queen very active on the king side. So overall, that would still be good for Magnus. Instead of that, here, Vladimir, he goes c4, expanding on the queen side, try to drive back that bishop. So a very interesting idea. And now here, Magnus, he has a choice. He can retreat the bishop back to, say, b1 or c2. Both those squares are very, very good for the bishop, staying on this very good diagonal here. However, there is the absolutely brilliant idea of knight to f4 immediately in this position. It's a little bit complicated, but you can give up the bishop on d3. For example, knight to f4, then c takes d3. Then the move is knight takes e6, removing the defender of the g7 pawn, and then you would threaten queen takes g7 in one move. That would be absolutely insane, but it didn't happen in the game. But if you do like analyzing these variations on your own, I would definitely recommend the move knight to f4. That's a really cool line to play around with. Instead, bishop c2 on the board for Magnus, staying cool, calm, and collected. Now here, Vladimir, he does find the idea of knight to h5, defending g7 and hitting the queen with tempo, very good. But again, Magnus, he finds the response queen to h3, getting the queen out of the attack, pressuring the knight on h5, and keeping the attack going. Now here, believe it or not, the best move for black is knight to f6. You have to retreat the knight. There is nothing better. But instead of that here, Vladimir, he plays a slightly dubious idea. That is the move g6. Now, this move does pressure the knight on f5. However, it also gives him control of the h6 square. And now, knight takes h6 is a very real threat. And Magnus, he just takes the free pawn. Knight takes h6 on the board. And now, king g7 for Vladimir. And now Magnus, knight to f5, an excellent move. This is not a knight sacrifice, as if you take the knight on f5, then queen takes h5 will be the move. You'll win the pawn on f5 and likely the game shortly thereafter. So, g takes f5 is not a possibility here. With that in mind, here Vladimir, his king is under check, and he just retreats his king, king g8 on the board. Now, in this position, how should Magnus Carlsen continue the attack? Well, there are a couple of different, very strong ideas. The strongest move is going to be g4, gaining space on the king side with the g-pawn and forcing the knight on h5 back immediately. Instead of that, Magnus played a slightly weaker but still pretty good move in the game, knight e to g3. This move puts pressure on the knight with the knight on g3. However, there is one flaw with this move, and here Vladimir Kramnik, he almost finds it. He starts with knight h takes g3, getting rid of one pair of minor pieces, an excellent idea. Now queen takes g3. Now the pawn on g6 is pinned to the king on g8, therefore g takes f5 is not playable. However, here in this position, Vladimir has the option of forcing the queens off the board with the move queen g5. This move is very, very strong. There's simply no good way to avoid the queen trade. For example, if you go queen to h3, then g takes f5 wins the knight on the f5 square. So that is the main idea, queen g5, virtually forcing queen takes g5 from Magnus. Instead of that here, Vladimir did go b4, expanding on the queen side, and this move is just too slow. It gives Magnus too much time to continue the attack. And here's what he does. First of all, knight to h6, hits the king on the g8 square. Where's the king going to go? It goes king g7 in the game. But now, Magnus Carlsen, in this position, he spots an absolutely brilliant way to keep the attack going and to blow up on the king side at the same time. Here he plays the move, knight takes f7, giving up the knight for the pawn. However, this is not a knight sacrifice, and here's why. In the game, Vladimir takes back with the king. That is the only move. King takes f7 on the board, but then Magnus jumps in with the bishop. Bishop takes g6, winning a second pawn and the rook on the e8 square in one more move. So the king moves, king e7, then bishop takes e8, and then king takes e8. Now here, let's do inventory. Magnus just gave up the knight on f7 and the bishop, but in return, he got 2 pawns and the rook on the e8 square. That means overall, Magnus Carlsen did win material. The rook and the 2 pawns are worth more than the 2 minor pieces, and beyond that, the king side is completely blown open. And now here, Magnus, he has a very simple attacking idea of just e4 or f4 and f5, gaining space in the center and on the king side, activating the rooks on e1 and f1, and just going after the black king on e8. So here, Magnus, he is clearly in control in this game. And now it is his move, and he does just break in the center with a very strong idea, e4, threatening e takes d5, opening up the e file for the rook on e1 against the king. All right, here, Vladimir, the former world champion, he has to find a good defensive setup. He has to find it right now. In the game, he finds the strongest idea, c3, expanding on the queen side, finally getting that break in. And now this move has 2 ideas. First of all, the rook on the f1 square is being attacked by the bishop on a6. So bishop takes f1 is a real threat. Magnus does have to respond. At some point, he is going to have to go rook to f2. However, beyond that, Vladimir is trying to create a pass pawn on the queen side. After, say, b takes c3, then b takes c3 back, that pawn will be a pass pawn, and that will be Vladimir Kramnik's main source of counterplay in this game that he needs so much. All right, here, Magnus Carlsen, rook f2 on the board, defends the rook, and here Vladimir, again, he has to find the right defensive setup. C takes b2 is a playable idea. However, there is a very real threat of queen g6 by Magnus. That would hit the king, pressure the knight, and the queen would be very, very active on that square. So with that in mind, here, Vladimir, he defends the queen g6 threat. He goes king to f7, defending the g6 square with the king. All right, now Magnus, b takes c3 on the board, b takes, and then the very strong idea, f4, expanding on the king side. Now the threat is f5, hitting the knight, and then going queen g6, as the f-pawn would defend the queen on g6. So that is a very, very big threat here. How is Vladimir going to respond? In the game, it goes d takes e4, likely the strongest idea. Instead, if you go knight takes d4, winning the free pawn on d4, then again, f5 and queen g6 is the idea. That would be very, very hard to stop. So instead, d takes e4 on the board for Vladimir, but now Magnus, all the same, f5 on the board, hits the knight on e6 and threatens queen g6 once again. All right, Vladimir, he has to move the knight. Where is it going to go? In the game, it goes back to the f8 square, knight to f8 on the board. Again, instead, if you go, say, knight g5, then f6 will be the move, blocking the queen's defense of the knight on g5, and that would be an absolute disaster. So, knight to f8 on the board, not a move you want to make. However, it does defend that g6 square for now. All right, Magnus here. Queen g6 is not a possibility yet, so with that in mind, he just takes the free pawn on e4 with the rook. Rook takes e4 on the board. Now we have rook b8 from Vladimir Kramnik, threatening ideas like rook b2 or rook to b1, trying to activate the rook on the b file. Very good idea. So now here, Magnus Carlsen, he is in complete control of this game, and he just wants to eliminate the idea of rook b1 with his back rank mating threat, so it goes h3 in this position. A very good defensive move. Now Vladimir, rook b1 on the board, hits the king, king to h2, and then queen to b8, trying to force those queens off the board, and it's very hard to avoid the trade of queens. Here you can go, say, rook e to f4 or rook f to f4, blocking the queen trade, but instead in the game, Magnus does allow it. He goes queen takes b8, trading the queens, then rook takes, and then rook to e3, attacking the pawn on c3. So now we do have an endgame with 2 rooks versus the rook and 2 minor pieces of Vladimir Kramnik. Now, normally Vladimir would have the advantage here with those 2 minor pieces versus the extra rook. However, Magnus, he has 1, 2, 3 extra pawns on the king side, and those pawns do give him a very large advantage. So now it's a battle between Magnus and his extra pawns on the king side versus Vladimir and his extra firepower with his 2 minor pieces versus the rook. It's going to be a very interesting endgame from here. All right, Vladimir here, he has to activate his pieces right now. How is he going to do it? Well, the best idea is likely getting the rook into play, say, rook d8, rook b4, and so on. But instead, he goes bishop c4, targeting the weak pawn on a2 with the bishop. Now here, Magnus, rook takes c3, hits the bishop, bishop d5, and then rook to c5 for Magnus, pressuring the bishop on d5 and that pawn on the a5 square. Now we have rook d8, defending the bishop, then rook takes a5, winning the free pawn. And now look at this. Magnus Carlsen in this position, he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 extra pawns in the endgame. Vladimir has literally 0 pawns here. It's going to be very hard for Vladimir to defend against all the pawns advancing literally all over the board. But again, he does have 2 minor pieces for the rook, and that does give him fighting chances in the endgame. All right, rook d7 on the board for Vladimir, then g4, getting those pawns rolling on the king side. Now, knight to h7 defends against g5 ideas for Magnus. King g3 activates the king, and now knight to f6. Now here, Magnus, rook c2, threatening ideas like rook c5 or rook to c8, and now rook to e7 for Vladimir. Now king to h4. Magnus, he is marching his king down the board. The threat now is king to g5, putting pressure on the knight on f6. Now bishop e4 for Vladimir, pressuring the rook on c2, and rook b2. Now knight d5 and king g5 for Magnus. Magnus, he is going for the kill here. He does not want to just push his pawns. He wants to checkmate the black king somehow. All right, rook d7, defending, but then rook to a6, threatening ideas like potentially rook h6, then rook to h7, trying to skewer the king and the rook. All right, rook c7 on the board, then rook to e6, pressuring the bishop on e4. The bishop has to move. Instead, knight c3 defends the bishop, but then Magnus, rook to f6 hits the king, king g7, rook g6, king f7, and then king to h6, threatening rook g7, again skewering the king and the rook on the 7th rank. All right, rook c8 defends, but then rook g7 drives back the king. We have king to f8 on the board. Now the king is trapped on the back rank, and now rook b6 activates the other rook on the 6th rank. All right, bishop d5 tries to defend the f7 square, but now Magnus, rook h7, once again threatening the skewer on h8. Rook to h8 is the big threat. All right, knight to e4, then rook h8, bishop g8, and now the bishop on g8 is pinned to the king. So with that in mind, rook g6 threatens rook takes g8. That would be game over on the spot. How is Vladimir going to defend? In the game, king to f7 does defend with the rook on the c8 square. However, Magnus is not done. He goes rook g7, hitting the king, and this forces the move king to f6, but that leaves the bishop on g8 undefended. And here, Magnus Carlsen, rook h takes g8 is the move. He wins the bishop, and here Vladimir is just down too much material. It's roughly 7 pawns according to my count, and in this position, Vladimir Kramnik, he resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game. All right, Chess YouTube, if you enjoyed this video, please smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much for doing that. It helps me out so much. And while you're at it, check out this video right here where Magnus Carlsen disrespects Vladimir Kramnik with the birds opening with the move 1f4. That game was incredible. I'm sure you're going to love it. Check it out. And I'll see you in the next video.